In October, it became known that the German EWZ Foundation had financed 2 high school student programs which promoted hatred of Israel. This EWZ State Foundation, its role is to compensate Holocaust slave workers and to fight contemporary anti-Semitism. In one of these hate programs sponsored by this Holocaust Foundation, a Dutch Jewish anti-Israeli extremist, Hayo Meyer, came to the Anne Frank High School in Gütersloh, and there he equated Palestinian suffering with the mass murder of Jews in the Holocaust, and he termed Israel a criminal state. Also in October, in the high school in the village of Nesbru in Norway, an exhibition sponsored by the Norwegian Church Aid was held on Palestine. It included a picture, which you can see here, of an Israeli flag crossed out, and under it, murder written in reverse underneath it. After an Israeli student at that high school protested and there was some bad publicity, the school finally decided to remove the exhibition. And you always think it cannot get worse. However, a few days ago, Hugo Dekkers, the secretary of the Belgian Socialist Teachers Trade Union, threatened the Jewish schools in Belgium. He wrote a letter to the Jewish paper there, Joods Actueel, concerning the announced expansion of the Israeli settlements after the Palestinians had become members of UNESCO. And Dekkers said in it, "If this is the reaction, I will, as union leader of the AOCD, bring the situation of the Jewish schools in Antwerp to the public attention. And I am afraid that you will get frightened." We know very little about this topic of the anti-Israel incitement in schools in the Western world. Yet, in my eyes, this is a topic which is critically important because in a certain number of schools in the Western world, in a number of countries, a new, young generation of Israel haters and anti-Semites is being formed. Now, first of all, to put it in perspective, I always work on the basis that there are about 16 categories of originators of delegitimization of Israel and anti-Semitism. And in the course of these years, on some of them, we know a lot about them. We have significant information about the hate of Israel coming out of Muslim states. We know quite a lot about anti-Semitism among Muslims in the Western world, the United Nations as a propagator of hate, NGOs, neo-Nazis, the left, academics, and so on. We know very little on some other perpetrators, the Christian anti-Semites and anti-Israelis, and the trade unions. But we know almost nothing on the subject which you see here under number 15, which is the schools. How is Israel delegitimated in schools? All we have are a few studies on a few subtopics of this issue in very few countries. We really need a major study on this topic, and that will require a lot of money. What can we do in the meantime? Not much. We can do 3 things. First of all, we can make an inventory of what exists, both the few studies which there are and some anecdotal material. Secondly, we can give some examples of the issues to be investigated. And thirdly, we can define an outline, if anybody would want to finance such a study, an outline of what should be the topics in that study. And with that, I'll later conclude. I should like to add that it absolutely makes no sense to study anti-Israelism in schools in isolation. It comes together with 2 other topics. The first one is anti-Semitism in schools, and the other one is the problems linked to Holocaust teaching, because very often Holocaust teaching, at least in Europe, is part of the curriculum, and it is there, when it is being taught, that many of the problems emerge in public. Now, what are the topics we should investigate? The first one is are textbooks and the curricula neutral? Then the second one is, are the teachers who teach there objective on the issue? The third one is, what are the attitude of non-Jewish students in schools where there are also Jewish students toward their schoolmates? And then there are lesser issues. Does the school offer Holocaust education? What are the responses of the pupils to it? Is there harassment of Jewish teachers in schools? And then finally, there are also questions which concern Jewish schools, where there are only Jewish students. Has there been violence, terrorism against Jewish schools? And Jewish schools often participate outside the school in activities with other schools. Are they harassed there? And what, final question, what do you do against it? Now, what data? I said they are very, very limited. What data are there available? I have, and I may not have done my work totally, I have been able to identify only in the whole world 7 studies concerning some aspect of hatred related to Jews and Israel in schools. In the United States, there have been 2 studies on textbooks. That has also been the case in France. In the Netherlands, there is a study in anti-Semitism in Amsterdam schools, in particular schools with a lot of Muslims. In Belgium, there is a study on Dutch-speaking schools in Brussels, anti-Semitism there. And finally, in Norway, there is a study on anti-Semitism, or better said, racism, including anti-Semitism in the schools in Oslo. That's all there is in the whole world. Now, I'm going to discuss these topics. First of all, the textbooks. Textbooks currently used in schools are sometimes a major source of biased anti-Israel teaching, but we know very little about it. In the 1990s, Mitchell Bart publishes a study on 18 of the most widely used history textbooks in American high schools, called Rewriting History in Textbooks. His conclusion, they are full of factual errors, oversimplification, omission, and distortion. And what is common in all this is that they always to the detriment of Jews and Israel. And he concludes, this leads to the conclusion that the authors are prejudiced. Bart concluded that American high schools are, as far as anti-Israeli teaching is concerned, even worse than universities. On the same subject, in 2008, the late Gary Tobin and Dennis Ibarra confirmed what Bart had concluded. They also found another thing, that Arab and Muslim interest groups try to whitewash and glorify all things Islamic and promote Islam in these textbooks. And in this way, a whole series of lies has permeated American textbooks. In France, 2 studies have been undertaken, and they find, for instance, that facts on the Middle East are presented in such a way that the suggestion is created that the Palestinian terrorism is one thing and general terrorism is something totally different. And how the Jews are presented in French history textbooks is even worse. One researcher, Joël Alouche Benayoun, summarizes it in the way of a caricature. And I'll read that out. In antiquity, there were the Hebrews. Their religion Judaism was significantly improved by Jesus, who founded Christianity. At the end of the 19th century, a Jew and French officer, Dreyfus, was accused of treason. That divided the country until the beginning of the 20th century. And in the middle of the 20th century, during the Second World War, Jews were exterminated, and other Jews who created Israel since then carry out an unjust war against the innocent Palestinians. In Great Britain, we have some proof from Muslim schools that anti-Semitism is far more prevalent there than in other schools. A Panorama television program aired by the BBC in November 2010 dealt with what is taught in Saudi-run Muslim schools in Britain. It found that these schools use textbooks from Saudi Arabia which teach children from six and older that Jews, and that means almost most of you in the audience that you are the descendants of monkeys and pigs. So, in fact, I'm a subhuman speaking to an audience mainly consisting of other subhumans. The Panorama program also showed that one textbook stated that Jews are cursed by God. It also asked children to list the negative qualities of Jews in British schools. Teenagers who follow the Saudi national curriculum are being told in the United Kingdom that Zionists aim to take over the world for Jews and say that the fabricated text of the protocols of the elders of Zion is true. And sometimes you don't need a whole book. You can incite children with a single sentence. For instance, in a Dutch language teaching book for the 6th grade in Belgium, students are asked to read sentences with the correct intonation. And one of these sentences they have to read aloud with the correct intonation is, when a Palestinian child in Jerusalem saw a Jewish soldier arriving, he shrank in fear. Now you only have to imagine what the reactions would be if there was in Belgian textbook a sentence for intonation, which included the sentence, after a Palestinian suicide terrorist killed many Jewish children and adults, the Belgian press gave most of its attention to the Israeli reaction to it. We will now move to a second subject, biased teaching. There we have no studies whatsoever. We thus live largely on an incidental and anecdotal character. And the cases which I mentioned at the beginning of my presentation from Germany and Norway illustrate that anything goes. Much of the information we have is necessarily indirect. You can check the anti-Israeli opinions among non-Jewish and Jewish school children. You then understand that you have often gotten these opinions from their teachers. In the US, one source of indirect information on biased teaching in schools is from the Orthodox Union because it has a youth group, the National Conference of Synagogue Youth, which has developed culture clubs for Jewish children across the US, and it reaches 30,000 Jewish youngsters. The former OU chief executive, Rabbi Tzvi Hirsch Weinreb, says, well, we find that many children, Jewish children, are very anti-Israeli because they have been very much brainwashed by an extremely anti-Israeli educational establishment. A major topic, of course, the harassment of Jewish students in public schools. A pioneering effort on this was done in France through the publication of a book written almost 10 years ago, which is called Les Territoires Perdus de la République, The Lost Territories of the Republic. Much of the problems mentioned in it of anti-Semitism are caused by some Muslim students. But also Christian students are harassed by these Muslim students. It would also be mistaken to say that the ideological hatred of these Muslims focuses exclusively on Jews and Israel. It's also focused on the United States, and their real aim is the hatred of French society. And this finally became very clear in the anti-French riots in France of autumn 2005. For statistics on harassment of Jewish students in schools, we should once again focus on Norway. In June 2011, the Oslo municipality published a study on racism and anti-Semitism among students of the 8th through 10th grade, and even the Norwegians were shocked by it. The study found that 33% of the Jewish students in Oslo schools regularly experience bullying at school. One Jewish student said that she knows no other Jewish student who hasn't been harassed in the schools. And according to the definition used by the people who did the study, that means that at least 2 or 3 times a person a month, the same person in a month, is either verbally or physically abused in Oslo schools as far as Jewish students are concerned. Jewish teachers are also sometimes harassed, and we have some information anecdotal entirely. Let me give you one more example from Norway, always Whenever I look for abuse, I always first look at Norway because it's so easy to find there. David Katznelson is an Israeli teacher who has lived in Norway for 15 years. He says that he has had a swastika spray painted on his mailbox, and his Jewish students are afraid to publicly disclose their face. That is a country which was called here a respectable democracy. We also have to discuss now what happens to Jewish schools. Well, first of all, over the past 40 years, there have been bomb and arson attacks on Jewish schools. You see the list here on the slide. Initially, this was mainly in Muslim countries and in Latin America. In 1995, there was a car bombing outside the Jewish school in Lyon, which wounded 14 people. And in the past decade, there have been a number of attacks on Jewish schools in Montreal. But also Jewish school children, when they go on school trips, for instance, are sometimes insulted, attacked, or harassed. For instance, this happens a number of times to the Jewish elementary school in Amsterdam, Rosh Pinah. And they are harassed when they participate in walks of schools and so on. I have tried in a short time to give you a largely, unfortunately, anecdotic overview of the situation. And now the question is, what programs are there to combat this? And then you find that there is virtually nothing. There is a program in Amsterdam. The Amsterdam municipality has developed a program in order to limit anti-Semitism and Israel hatred, mainly among Muslim students. It has had some good results because the number of anti-Semitic Muslim students has gone down, but it still remains far and far higher than that of the native Dutchman. And one of the problems, because these programs bring new problems, one of the problem of the program is that it teaches Holocaust and the problems of the Middle East together. The Jewish community has protested against this mix many times, and it helps nothing. The second other program is the so-called FAST program, Fighting Anti-Semitism Together in Canada. It's led by a community of non-Jewish Canadian business and community leaders. It tries to educate students in grades 6, 7, and 8 about the dangers of intolerance, and with an emphasis on anti-Semitism. And it seems to be quite a good program. Okay, that was in a nutshell the story. Where do we go from here? First of all, you have realized how extremely incidental, anecdotal it all is. I've tried to give you some kind of picture of all kinds of snippets you can collect. It also indicates the many aspects which should be studied. And in my final slide, I have set those out, and I leave it here for the coming 2-3 minutes until I end.
Thank you for saving me the need to...
So, what goes on in many schools today in the world, in the Western world, can be extremely dangerous for Jewish children, because the experiences you have at school stay with you for your whole life. Some Jewish parents, again, mainly in Norway, have told me that their children are still traumatized many years later by the anti-Semitism they experienced in school. And of a very different nature, it is that many high school students, including Jewish ones, may arrive on campus with a bias they have acquired previously at their high schools. So, to conclude, a new generation of Israel haters is being educated in some parts of the Western world, the Western democratic world. Part of this is done at home, but another part by those who are charged with forming their minds and values, their educators. We have to invest much more effort, the parents, the Israeli government, and the Jewish communities. Because, as I have tried to explain, what is happening is dangerous to both Jewish children and to Israel. Thank you for your attention.